Hello friends, welcome back. Welcome to the concepts of CISSP. We are continuing our discussion in Domain 3 Security Architecture and Engineering in discussing secure design principles. So in secure design principles, we are referring Salzer and Schroeder's design principles, and we have covered few of the principles like economy of design, fail-safe default, complete mediation. In this video, we will be discussing three more secure design principles, which are open design, least privilege and segregation of privilege. When we discuss least privilege, we will be referring need to know as well. So need to know principle, segregation of privilege and least privilege, right? So let's start our discussion with open design. What is meant by the principle of open design? So in open design, in a very simple term, if a system is designed in a way that its design specification is available to general public, then we say that this system is following the principle of open design. The system may be accepting some input, producing some output, and to enforce its security there will be some keys and password. So the principle of open design says that we keep the keys and passwords secret, we don't disclose them, but the system design is open for interpretation, for study, for testing to general public. That is the spirit of open design principle. So what is open design? In a very simple term, open design is built upon standards, protocols and interfaces that have published a specification. When we say published a specification, it means that it is published for general public. Now open design do not mean that we should publish the design publicly which we create for an organization, right, or which we create to produce some product. There may be cases that we publish the design to general public if we are selling the design or if we are marketing the design, right? In that case it's valid, but in most of the cases our design is categorized as something which is if it is not critical but it is confidential to the organization. Let's say the data center design or the floor arrangement. So those information is not meant for general public. So those information can be classified as private information or for office use only. Those kind of classification we can attach to the design. But this do not mean that that if a system is designed on open standards, we have this obligation of sharing the end product or end design with general public. It's not that way. We can keep the design obscure, or we can apply the internal data classification labels to the design, and if we are sharing those design with some customers or some vendors, we can sign non-disclosure agreement if that's necessary, right? So this is how we understand the obscure nature of data security in contrast with the open design, right? So when we have this a design which is created on open standards, we keep the design obscure, we keep the design private, but we don't rely on the obscurity of the data. What we do perform the due diligence and due care for the confidentiality or secrecy of the design, and we do document the design assumptions, constraints and any detail which can pose the risk at any point of time. So this is all about open design. I think it's very simple to understand that any design which is based on open standards, open protocol or open interface, right? The example of open standards could be IEEE standards or ISO standards. Open protocols, like if you are from the networking background, you know there are some routing protocols which are open standards like border gateway protocol or OSPF, whereas there are some proprietary protocol like EIGRP, right? So if the standards and protocols and the interfaces are open in design, then we say that it's following the principle of open design. Now Open systems allow easy integration using API. API is application programming interface. So if we are building our system on the principle of open design, creating API and having an ecology of different vendors who are also following open design, we can easily communicate with each other. That's one advantage of open design, right? And in open design, we allow researchers or experts or academicians, students, hackers, everyone can discover vulnerabilities, and they can publish those vulnerabilities. With this condition, there is high chance that our design can be made more resilient. That's all about open design. Now we will move to the next topic, which is separation of privilege. Now when we talk of privilege, we are actually talking two things, right? We should always keep in mind that the privilege includes permission and rights, right? So you have this word privilege, which is a function of two different independent function, or two different independent variables, you can say, in a mathematical sense. One is called permission and another is called rights. So privilege, when we talk of permission, we think of giving permission of a subject to certain type or class of data, right? And when we say rights, it means we are giving rights to do some activity, right? So permission includes giving permission to data, and rights means rights to perform some system task, right? So when we call privilege, these two terms should be in our mind. One is the permission and second is the right. Now we will look into this term, separation of privilege. Separation of privilege is also known as separation of duties. Privilege and duties are the two sides of same coin. So I will explain how it is and how we can say that they are the same thing. One more word we should be aware of is segregation. So when we say separation of privilege, sometimes it is referred as segregation of privilege, or when we say separation of duties, sometimes it is referred as segregation of duty. So separation of privilege, separation of duty, segregation of duty, or segregation of privilege are all same thing, right? So the term privilege is from system or object's perspective, right? So in any communication or in any transaction, we have a subject and then we have an object. So the subject is an active user or a process or an application. An object may be a user, may be a file, may be a process as well, one process calling to another process. Now when we say privilege, privilege is from the system or object's perspective or destination perspective, right? So we always have privilege of certain kind on some object, right? Now when we say duty, duty is from the perspective of source, from the perspective of a user or a subject, right? So in real world, what will happen is a user will be assigned some role, right? If you recall Domain 2, there we discussed about how hiring process work, what is a job description and a job role. So a person is hired for a role, right? Now based on the role, some duties are assigned to that person, right? So when we look from the people side or from the person side, we say that the person is having some duties, right? And with these duties, he will be having access to certain files, certain infrastructure, certain applications, some operating system. So all these are system. So with this duty, the person will have some privilege over the system, right? So now you can visualize that it is the same thing when we say that separation of privilege or separation of duties. Actually, we are talking the same thing but from a different reference frame. When we say separation of duties, we are talking from the perspective of user or from the perspective of subject. When we say segregation or separation of privilege, we are talking from the perspective of object or from the perspective of end system. In separation of privilege discussion, we can think of a user first. User is a subject and the user carries some privilege, right? Let's say the privilege X, it's a capital X. Now this privilege X is with the user, and when we see that this privilege can be abused by the user and we want to enforce, let's say, 5 different control points. One way of achieving this is that we actually segregate or separate this privilege X into 5 different privileges. So the capital X will be broken into X1 plus X2, X3, X4 and X5, right? Now this act of breaking a bigger privilege into a smaller privilege is called SoD, which we refer segregation of duty. Why we are using the word duty here? Because we are talking from the perspective of user. Now what is going to happen is that these 5 different privilege will be assigned to 5 different individuals, right? So it will create different duties and we will have different people working on different pieces of the privilege, right? So if there is a process which required one subject or one user to finish the task, now we are finishing the same task with 5 different user or 5 different subject, right? Now the completion of the task is dependent on 5 people which must agree to complete the whole task. So if there was only one person, then it was a very risky situation, that if that person is not performing well or if he is absent or the process is down, or only one process, then the job fails. Or the person, if he is malicious, it can be hacked. If this is a program, it can be hacked, or the person is there, it can be social engineered. So now you have 5 people, so the social engineering effort will be 5 times more than if we have one person, right? I'll give you an example. In a bank, there is a person who actually checks the bank check and approves it and gives the money back to the customer, right? So if one person do all the task, what will happen? There is a high chance that the person can do some sort of corruption. Now if we segregate this task with a person who will check the bank check and he will forward the check to a different person who will approve it, and the approved check will go to a different person who will see how much money he has to give to the customer. So we have got 3 people. Now there is a less risk of doing any fraud or any corruption in the whole process, because if some fraud has to be done, these three people has to work work together, which is referred as the term collusion, right? Now this is how we do separation of privilege, and with the separation of privilege we also understand that this refers to some separation of duty, right? So one other way to understand this is that duty is a function of privilege, right? So if we break duties, then we break privileges. If we break privilege, we break duties, right? So privilege is an independent function. It can be changed by authentication and authorization server, and accordingly the duties will change, right? In cinema hall, you will see that a person who assigns the movie ticket and a person who checks the movie ticket, and there is a third person who collects the movie ticket. So there is a less chance of fraud because we have actually segregated the whole process into 3 different processes, right? So we change the privilege, so accordingly the duties change, and then we need 3 different persons to carry out the task. So this is all about separation of privilege. Now there is a term which is also very popular, which is called 2-person control. So the 2-person control can be viewed as, in this example, as I have said, that X is a bigger privilege. is separated into 5 different smaller privileges. So if there is only 2 privilege segregation, so x equals to x1 plus x2, then we can think that this will create a condition of 2% control. The common example is like if you go to a bank and you have something in your bank locker, then you have a key and then there is a bank staff who is also have the key, and the knowledge of keys are totally different, right? So to carry out a task you need 2 person and both of them have separate knowledge or separate technology which should work in synchronization to achieve one task. If that is implemented, we say that this is an example of 2% control. We can have 3% control, 4% control, 5% control, right? Those kind of arrangement we can have based on the security need, but most commonly 2% control. Like if you want in some high secure or high risk area, if you want to detonate some bomb, like you want to send some missile, then you have 2 keys which must be turned on simultaneously to launch a missile. So those kind of things are very popular in military space. Now the next topic which we will be discussing is least privilege, right? So what is least privilege? Least privilege is basically an implementation of need to know principle. So to understand least principle, first we have to understand what is the principle of need to know. The principle of need to know and least privilege, both they are related with data and system access, right? This should be in our mind first, that both the principle, need to know principle, and least privilege principle are related with data and system access plus authorization. Now what is need to know? Need to know is closely related with security clearance. Imagine a person who joins any organization, government or corporate organization. So based on the job role, he is given a security clearance. Security clearance is something which is mostly used in government organization, but I will use this example to demonstrate the principle of need to know. So need to know is related with security clearance. And what is security clearance? Security clearance grants user or subject access only to data or resources they need to perform assigned work or task. So this is how a security clearance is given to a person, and the security clearance reflects the need to know qualities of a subject, right? The security clearance aims to uphold confidentiality of the information. This is also a point which we should keep in mind, important for the CISSP questions, from the perspective of CISSP questions in exam, right? So least privilege is basically implementation part of the need to know principle, right? So need to know is administrative in nature. It doesn't automatically grant access to data, rather clears a subject in its authorization to handle data or system level, right? As I have already explained in the last principle, that when we talk of privilege, this includes permission to data and rights to perform system task, right? So the permission of data and rights to perform system task, if you look closely, both the subtask of a privilege or sub privileges inside the privilege refers to the confidentiality and integrity part of the CIA triad, right? So least privilege is the act of granting minimum privilege necessary to perform assigned work or task, right? So least privilege is the verb, you can say, and need to know is the is not the verb, it's the definition or the statement which defines the security clearance of a subject, right? Both are related with data and system access and authorization, and least privilege protects confidentiality and integrity of the data, right? So I hope this this whole term separation of duty, need to know and least privilege is understood holistically. In CISSP, it's very important to know what are the links between different concepts, right? So I will just reiterate the whole story again. So when we talk of segregation of privilege, we are basically talking about breaking one work into a small work with an intention that we break the privileges at different meaningful levels, right? So the segregation of privilege give rise to segregation of duties. As many segregation we do, as many people we will need, or as many subjects we will need to function, to perform the same task. That is segregation of privilege or segregation of duties. Second thing I explained is the need to know. The need to know is basically defined by the hiring process or the HR process or the process which actually onboards a subject, right? It shows the clearance level of the subject, at what clearance level he is cleared to. Maybe he is cleared to secret or top secret or just for the confidential, right, information. But simply giving a need to know definition in terms of security clearance do not qualify a person to exactly or actually go and access the file. There will be some system or some process that need to be kicked in to give the permission. And that's the second part, which is least privilege. The least privilege is the implementation of the need to know principle, so that a person is given only that enough minimum rights which will enable him to do the task, right? So when we talk least privilege, we talk two things. One is we talk about permission, and second thing we talk about rights. So least privilege means minimum permission to the exact data set subject needs to need to access to perform the task, plus minimum rights to do the minimum system task needed to carry out the job. I hope this is clear. This video is useful. If you really like my work, you can subscribe to my channel, put a thumbs up, and I hope to see you again in my next video. Thanks and best of luck for your CISSP exams.